Tonight, before I start class 6 of our Orthodox survival course, I have a little pre-class that I'm calling corrigenda, a clarification, and an amplification. Corrigenda are things that need to be corrected. It's from Latin, to correct. Corrigenda are to be corrected things. So as we go along, I'm re-listening to these recordings and looking at my notes and noticing things that are a little off or that need to be clarified. And one thing I noticed early on in the Class 2 recording, I mistakenly said that this English historian that we quoted, Christopher Dawson, was a theologian. He's not a theologian, not in any sense, or he didn't claim to be one. He was a historian. Actually, he's a very great historian. And in the English language, he's probably the best example of what we're calling a meta-historian, someone who wrote just magisterial works giving beautifully written overviews of entire periods of history, of entire cultures. But you have to remember, if you read him, if you're interested in reading him, just remember he's a Roman Catholic. So he sees things from that Roman Catholic point of view, and you have to filter that when you're reading him. But he's actually, for people in the English language, he's one of the best people to introduce this idea of meta-history, of seeing the whole sweep of history, the whole sweep of cultures. In the Class 3 recording, there was a beautiful quote we quoted from St. John Cassion's conferences, in the Conference of Abba Moses. And I used the term locus classici. Well, that's bad Latin grammar. It's either locus classicus or loci classici to make the adjective go properly with the noun. But what is a locus classicus? A locus classicus is a very important quote, a very important passage from the literature of any particular field, literature of history, the literature of theology, the literature of philosophy. The Locus Classicus is a very important quote. It's one of the places you go to first when you're trying to help people understand a whole theme or a whole subject. Okay, it's an authoritative quote, and this is a very beautiful quote from the Conference of Abba Moses on the aim of a monk. And because in class 3, we were talking about the spiritual life, and the aim of a monk really is also the aim of a Christian, which is he says our long-term aim is the kingdom of heaven. But what's our intermediate goal? We all know our long-term goal is the kingdom of heaven. Well, how do we get there? What's our intermediate goal? And Abba Moses says our intermediate goal is purity of heart. Puritas cordis, St. John Cassion wrote in Latin. Even though he was interviewing these monks, they were probably speaking Greek and Coptic, but he wrote it in Latin. And puritas cordis, purity of heart. And this passage in the Conference of Abba Moses is one of the loci classici. It's a great locus classicus. It's a very important turning point, you might say, in spiritual literature, where this was announced as the immediate goal of Christian life, is purity of heart. And so we were discussing that in Class 3. Another thing to clarify, last week I mentioned we were discussing sacred art, and I mentioned that the Parthenon in Athens became a Christian church for many centuries. Many people don't realize that. In our present age, where there's such an emphasis on, or such a resurgence of neo-paganism and secularism, it's often covered up or forgotten that for many centuries, perhaps longer than it was actually a pagan temple to Athena, it was a church of the Holy Virgin. And of course, which is only appropriate, right? Because Parthenos in Greek means virgin. It was called the Parthenon because it was dedicated to the virgin goddess Athena, the patroness of Athens. And then the church converted it into a church dedicated to the true Holy Virgin, to the Most Holy Mother of God. And of course, the Muslims stopped that. It became a mosque. And then it became, during the wars in the 18th century, it was an ammunition dump. And I forget, I need something to look this up. Either the British or the Russians were fighting with the Turks, and it got blown up, either by the Greek revolutionaries or by the Turks, or a shell from the Allies or something blew it up. That's why it's in the partial state that it's in today. So, but then I went on to say, I said, well, the Parthenon was a Christian church. I went on to say, but the Christians didn't use the pagan temples as churches, or they didn't model the churches on temples. But in general, that is true. There were some examples of turning pagan temples into churches, but when the Christians built churches from scratch, and the church said, okay, now we're going to build our own churches, they didn't use the pagan temple as the model for building churches. Why? Because the pagan temples were designed to be backdrops to outdoor ceremonies. Many people don't realize that, but actually in the civic religion of the Greek city-states and the Roman civic religion, these beautiful temples with their long elevations of columns and so forth, and the beautiful architrave and the entire ensemble, right, of a classical temple, which we all know so well, was actually designed to be primarily a backdrop for public ceremonies, sacrifices or games, a lot of games. Also, the reading of auguries and choosing magistrates by lot, and all these public ceremonies that constituted the religious aspect of the civic life of the Greek city-states, or of the Rome itself and the Roman cities. And so the emphasis in a pagan temple is exteriority. It's exterior. And the interior was usually, if you look carefully at those old temples, they have very few or no windows. Right? It was very dark inside, and it was kind of cramped, and there was the statue of the god or the goddess, and that was about it. And very little went on the inside. And it was designed to be a backdrop for ceremonies on the outside. Of course, Christian worship is the opposite. Right? A Christian church is most noted and is designed for what goes on the inside, which is the gathering of the church. The very word church, our word church in Greek, ekklesia, is from the verb ekkalio, to call out, meaning to gather, a gathering of people. And the Hebrew is kahal, a gathering. And we have this word in Greek. In Latin, it becomes ecclesia. Of course, in Romanian, of course, it's biserica, which is actually from this word basilica, which was actually originally the form of the church building took, but then it became to be applied to the church building and to the church in general. So a Christian church then is primarily an interior space for worship. And so when the church was building churches, and of course this really took off in the 4th century with the peace of the church after St. Constantine, and the building of many churches, starting with beautiful basilicas that St. Constantine himself and St. Helena sponsored in Rome, in the Holy Land, and of course the building of churches in Constantinople, which the saint founded. The form they chose was the basilica. The basilica was the Roman civic building. Remember that the life in the Roman Empire and the life in the Hellenistic city-states, throughout Greece, Asia Minor, Syria, Egypt, and so forth, was centered around public gatherings. Right? And the temples, the pagan temples, were for the religious public gatherings which took place outside, but the basilica was for indoor gatherings, namely courts, or meetings of magistrates, or markets, or elections. It's a place where they went to be citizens, to conduct public business. Was the basilica. It's a large rectangular building with a very large, wide open space on the inside, with a raised dais at one end where the magistrate or the person in charge would sit, the important person would sit, and you'd go there to present your petition, or they would stand there to render their judgments, whatever the event was, whatever was going on. So you can see how easily this was adapted to Christian worship, but the dais became the altar, and the screen, or the rail separating the magistrates from the laos, from the people, became the iconostation, right, the templon, the icon screen. And it was easily adapted to the worship of the church. But very early on, this division also came to be seen as a fulfillment, or as echoing the division of the Old Testament temple. Remember, which had the holy place and the Holy of Holies. See? So all this worked together, in the providence of God, all this worked together to create an entire liturgical or theological view of the church building. But it started with this basilica form. So we're going to come back and talk about that. So my point was to clarify this idea. Yes, the Parthenon did become a Christian church. Also, the Pantheon in Rome became a Christian church. The Pantheon is one of the more famous and intact buildings in Rome. It's a great circular building. And over the lintel it says Agrippa fecit. Agrippa, one of Augustus's chief lieutenants, was responsible for the building of this magnificent building. But it was originally a pagan temple. It was converted into a church. But these are the exception. The rule was that the Christians did not take over pagan temples. Generally, they destroyed them, razed them, and they would use the foundations, or they'd use the materials from the temple to build churches. But they rarely did a wholesale conversion of a temple into a church. Okay. Another clarification or amplification. I want to refer to this man, Petirim Sorokin. I quoted him last week. And I felt that I needed to clarify this idea of ideational art. That quote had the term ideational art, but I didn't bother to define that or clarify that for anyone. It's a category into which Petirim Sorokin, this Russian immigrant writer, puts sacred art. And the idea of ideational, what he means by ideational art or ideational culture, is a culture in which the next world, or the invisible world, the world of God, and then also God's angels and saints, is the real world, or the more real world, and that the art and all the artifacts of the culture are meant to be a conduit or a mediation of this real world to our world. Now, Sorokin, later on, not tonight, but in another class, I'm going to talk about his whole scheme for understanding the rise and fall, or the change in cultures. He's a very interesting person. He was a Russian immigrant. He was a sociologist. He founded the Department of Sociology at Harvard University. Well, of course, when we hear Harvard nowadays, we think of leftism and liberalism and so forth, but actually he was a cultural conservative. And he was also really this book, The Crisis of Our Age, which is sort of summarizes a lot of his ideas, really is a startling diagnosis of what was wrong with modern culture. It was delivered in the 1930s, but it's amazing. His indictment of contemporary culture is really amazing, and it's prophetic, very prescient, and we don't. As Christians, we don't agree with all of his theories. He was not, even though he was a baptized Orthodox Christian. He was in Russian terms, he was a liberal. He was part of the Kerensky provisional government. So unfortunately, sadly, he was part of the government that overthrew or pushed the abdication of the Tsar in February of 1917. And so he was a liberal, but he was not a communist. He was a fierce anti-communist. After the Bolsheviks took over, he spent time in prison. He fled Russia. He ended up in the United States. But some of his model for history his model of helps us to understand in these sociological terms the transition from an ideational to what he calls a sensate culture. The sensate culture is what we live in. For centuries now, we've lived Western Europe and America have been developing this highly developed, highly and materially successful sensate culture, where the emphasis is on this world. I mean, all the cultural manifestations are worldly. Even religious manifestations are actually worldly in form. They may be spiritual in content. For example, a Renaissance Madonna, the content is a picture of the Holy Virgin Mary, but the form is very worldly. It's sensate. It's not iconographic. It's not what he would call ideational. See, so when we get to the Renaissance, or rather to the late Middle Ages, the transition to the Renaissance, I want to come back and talk about some of Sorokin's ideas, because they're helpful in helping us have this understanding. So people like this Dawson or like Sorokin, they're not holy fathers, they're not saints, they're not spiritual writers, but they are secular scholars who give us tools or ways of approaching or understanding the historical events or people or movements that we're talking about. And we'll see in his notes, later on when we start using Father Seraphim Rose's notes, we'll see that he refers to a lot of secular scholars because they give a lot of really insightful information about the things that we're going to be studying. Now tonight we're going to use Wikipedia to look at some of our pictures, and I want to exculpate myself in advance. I'm not an advocate of Wikipedia as a source of all truth. It's not. Obviously, we know that the Wikipedia articles can be tendentious, biased, that they're partial, they're defective. A serious scholar doesn't use Wikipedia as a source, right? It's just handy. It's a handy place to go on the internet if you just want to find pictures of something or a general introduction to something or links to something. Okay? So that's why but it's to use the vulgar phrase, it's a quick and dirty way to start studying something. So tonight, our class 6, our topic, we're going to continue our discussion from last week of sacred art. And I want to recapitulate the basic ideas we discussed last week. What are the characteristics of a genuine Christian sacred art? I've just reproduced the last part of our notes from last week to review this. Recall that in our very first class, when we were talking about the early church, we described the character of the early church as eschatological, that is, oriented to the end of the world, to the second coming of Christ. Right? The early Christians had a very keen sense of the Lord's imminent coming, as we should always have. Right? The early church is otherworldly, as Orthodoxy has always remained otherworldly. Right? Martyric, witnessing to the faith, willing to die for the faith, to suffer for the faith. That's a mark of the true church. And ascetical, always engaged in spiritual exercise, in the cleansing of our senses, in the control of the passions, in spiritual growth. Okay. Now these insights we discussed in our later 2 classes regarding the church's true spiritual school, that is, what is true spirituality or true spiritual life, and true theological method. How did the fathers arrive at true theology? Okay. Those insights led us in the same direction, which is to conclude that a genuine sacred art must lead the believer into purification of the senses, cleansing of the passions, and pure prayer in this life. So true sacred art has a very specific purpose. Okay? Purification of our senses, cleansing from our passions, pure prayer in this life. That's the process of Orthodox spiritual life. And thus to the heavenly kingdom in the next life, which kingdom he will already have experienced through mysteriological, that is the sacraments, right, and prayerful communion with God. So the architecture and the art has the same purpose that the holy mysteries have, that the theology has, that the spiritual teaching has, which it's anagogical. Last week we discussed this Greek word, anagogi. Ana means up, and ago means lead, I lead. So sacred art needs to lead us, and everything in the life of the church is supposed to lead us up. You know that's something. One of the criteria to know, well, is this authentically Orthodox? Is say, well, does it lead me up, or does it just keep me down, wallowing in the senses, wallowing in this world, wallowing in what's lesser or inferior? Does it lead me up? Okay. So the purpose of Orthodox art is not to celebrate the world, right? But to lead the soul upwards to union with God. Now, as a byproduct, because real Orthodox art isn't worried about this world, it's leading us to the next world, as a byproduct, paradoxically, it ends up being the most beautiful commentary on this world. The transformation of the elements of this world into the most beautiful things you can imagine. See? So Orthodox art is not anti-nature. On the contrary, remember we talked last week that the church was fighting the errors of the dualists, like the Manichees, who said that matter is evil, and all iconoclasm, all these iconoclasts, whether the classical iconoclasts of the Byzantium or the modern Protestant iconoclasts, or other radical dualists or people who hate matter, right, are always denying that matter can lead us to God. On the other hand, materialists and pagans worship matter, right? They wallow in it, right? Like radical environmentalists, right? Who want to replace Christianity with Gaia worship and this kind of thing. Right? But both the iconoclasts and the neo-pagans end up in the same place, which is this radical divorce or dualism between the material and the spiritual. The church has the answer, which is the church is not materialistic, and the church is not dualistic. The church is sacramental, mysteriological, in which the church, by the grace of God, the church takes matter, the nature, right, transforms it so it becomes both more fully itself and a conduit or a means, a mediation for the believer to rise to God, the anagogical function to rise to God. Right. So this anagogical function, then, to go on with our notes, it necessitates that true sacred art must be hierarchical and hieratic. Hierarchical and hieratic. Okay? Why hierarchical? Because the forms and images of our liturgy, the art, everything involved in Orthodoxy, the forms and images are part of a great hierarchy of forms which starts with God himself, right? The one who's above all hierarchies. Then it extends to the heavenly hierarchies, the angels, the Mother of God, the angels and the saints. It extends down into the world. We're part of this great, it's part of what gives us our great security, our great happiness, our great sense of belonging as Orthodox, is that we're not just part of some random gathering or some club or something that people made up. We're actually part of this vast cosmic hierarchy extending from the invisible world to the visible world. And the art of the church and everything, all the arts, the architecture, the visual art, the chant, everything involving all of our senses, the movements, the liturgical movements within the church, the priest's vestments, everything involved in our sensible worship is to lead us to the invisible or to the spiritual. And it's all part of a beautiful hierarchy. It leading us, because for us to be led up, there has to be a place to go. And the place to go is up the hierarchy of being, right? Ultimately to God himself. But also, the forms and images are hieratic. Hieratic means priestly. Hieros in Greek means priest. So the art, what is the role? What is the function of a priest? A priest receives the material offerings, right? And through prayer and sacrifice, the offerings are transformed and become a means of uniting the person who made the offering to God. So art in the church, one of the marks of the church is that it's priestly, it's hieratic, it transforms us. Of course, ultimately there's only one great high priest, our Lord Jesus Christ, who offered himself on the cross, and the one truly all-sufficing and necessary, the one true sacrifice. But then but derivative from that, right, participating in that one sacrifice of Christ, that one transformation that gave rebirth to the entire universe, is all the actions of the church, where we are reborn in our baptism, in a chrismation, in Holy Communion, in all the sacraments, in all the blessings, in all the icons. We're reborn. We make offerings, right? We bring the prosper to church, we bring the koliva to church, we offer the wine, we donate icons, we bring various offerings, but above all, the offering of ourselves is the most important offering. And the offerings that we bring are transformed, most importantly, of course, the bread and wine that become the body and blood of Christ. And receiving the sacrifice that's been transformed, we are transformed. And we become a sacrifice, the sacrifice of our hearts, of ourselves. That's the sacrifice God wants, of our hearts, back to him. He who sacrificed his Son for us. And the sacred art is a participation in this hieratic function of transformation, offering and transformation, transforming us to make us citizens of the heavenly kingdom, make us fit for paradise. So true sacred art has all of these characteristics. Another characteristic of sacred art is transparency. Remember, last week we talked about this. We talked about exploring the fact that in the late antique art, the art of the late ancient world, emphasizes sculpture and three-dimensional art, right? But the church used this very sparingly, as we'll see tonight, mostly in bas-reliefs on sarcophagi in the early Christian art. There's very little or no examples of completely three-dimensional art, because the form itself is opaque. Remember, opaque means you can't see through it. So there are two meanings of opaque. One is literal, I can't see through it. I can't see through that wall to the street. But the other meaning of opaque is figurative. You can't see through something or someone to its inner meaning. Like, that person's personality is very opaque. He hides himself, right? He's not transparent, right? This writing is very opaque. The author seems to have concealed what he means by his writing rather than revealed what he means by his writing. See? So in that second sense, truly Orthodox art is transparent, not opaque. Right? We see through the icon. The common phrase, very popular phrase, is "window to heaven." Right? We see through the icon to the other world, and also the one represented is looking at us. They're in that other world looking at us. Right? It's a two-way. It's a two-way transparency. Right? They see us, and we see them. That's transparent. This is why the classic interior of an Orthodox church is to cover the church with icons, and most classically with gold, right? Mosaic or gold leaf behind the icons, so that the entire inside of the church is a brilliant, shimmering interior, and the glass is not stained glass, which is a medieval Western invention that came after they separated from the church. But a real Orthodox church should not have stained glass, but have translucent glass. Translucent means you don't see all the way through, but the light comes in, and the light shines on the gold of the iconography. And when you step into this kind of a church, you're immediately stepping into another world. See, that's a paradigmatic, the most complete example of what we're talking about. This transparency. Okay. And that reflects a spiritual reality, which is as we grow spiritually, in a true Orthodox way, not in some phony way or some pathological way or some deluded way or some egocentric way, but in a true Orthodox way. Our true Orthodox personality is transparent. The simplicity of the gospel, the heart of the child, is transparent. Okay. And the church's teachings are transparent. They light us up. We read a Holy Father, Life of a Saint. It's like a light is shining from the other world, and it lights up the inside of your soul. You want to be like that. You want to become transparent. So another aspect of sacred art is its transparency, which is why the church generally eschewed sculpture. Sculpture is not inherently heretical or something. It's just less suited to the task at hand. A piece of sculpture, a magnificent piece of sculpture, can certainly uplift you. It can certainly inspire you with noble ideas about someone or something that's not present. But it's somewhere else. You're stuck here, and it's somewhere else. And that statue is like just a meteor that landed from another planet, and it's just sitting there, and you can admire it and think about it, but it doesn't lead you. It doesn't mediate the other reality. It's just kind of a reminder. It might be a very beautiful reminder. I mean, Michelangelo's Pietà, or David, or Moses. This is, how can you not admire this? You'd have to be a real Philistine, a real fanatic who hates everything Western, right? Not to admire such things. But it's not sacred art. It's very beautiful. It has a sacred subject matter, but it's not sacred art, because the form is inherently opaque. You stop right there admiring it. It draws attention to itself. And it can inspire you with noble or pious thoughts, but it does not immediately mediate the actual reality. Whereas the simplest icon of the Christ, Panagia, the saint, a very simple icon that an old lady buys a print at a market and sets it up in her little room, and immediately this simple icon, or even a print of a simple icon by an unknown artist, is a mediation to this other world. A good example of that is this chapel we're sitting in. The architecture is atrocious, right? This is it's anti-architecture. I mean, this is modern. This is a modern space just thrown up overnight to make money. It has no architectural value at all, right? But we've brought into this space so many aspects of traditional art. We've brought in these prints of beautiful or famous icons, or a few hand-painted icons. We have the beautifully made temple and iconostas. We light candles before icons. We have the 17th century icon of the not made by hands. And this in this simple way, this sterile and completely secular space is made into a holy place. Right? Because Orthodox art has this overwhelming power, whereas I've been in Gothic cathedrals in Europe. I'll never forget my first, I'm half French. I've always had an affinity for France. I love France. I'll never forget my first French Gothic church. There was St. John the Theologian in Lyon, where actually the infamous, from our Orthodox point of view, the infamous Councils of Lyon took place in the 13th century. Infamous from our point of view because they were union councils where we were forced to acknowledge Rome. But so I was so eager to see this great Gothic cathedral, and I walked in, and I was overwhelmed with the technical mastery, the amazing accomplishment of this building. But it weighs you down. Right? You admire it. You can't help but be in awe at it, but it doesn't mediate the presence of God. Right? Whereas we walk into this funny little office space with a lowered ceiling here in Rochester Hills, Michigan, and we just look at prints of Orthodox icons, and we're lifted up to heaven. See, so this is a difference between grace-filled art and truly sacred art, and art that may be created by great masters, highly intelligent people, and highly dedicated people. You can imagine. We know the dedication of the people who erected the high and late medieval cathedrals in Europe. And yet, it's still not, it's magnificent, but it's not truly sacred art. It has already become something else. Just a little bit, but it's stepped over the line, and it's become something else. But we'll talk about that when we get to the Middle Ages. All right. So last week we pointed out that the art of the church, getting back to the art now of the early church, we pointed out that the art of the early church was very simple and undeveloped. Okay? Due in some part to the faith's frequently illegal status, which inhibited the building of churches and inhibited the elaborate development of forms. Christian art in this period was either purely symbolic. We talked about the fish anagram, the Isus Christos Theo Ios Sotir, Ichthys, the fish symbol, which is referred to an anagram, Jesus Christ, Son of God, Savior. Also, the chi rho, right? Just the letters, chi and rho in Greek, Christ for Christos. And also there are the childlike paintings of scriptural scenes and images. And a place we can go to see this, see examples of this. Of course, when we talk about all of these things, we have to just show a few examples. But there are classic examples that are presented in all the sacred art courses. They use certain classic examples, and the classic example of early Christian art, of course, is the catacomb art in Rome. Under what in ancient times are the suburbs of Rome. Now it's in the city, but in the ancient times, the suburbs of Rome are vast networks of tunnels or catacombs that were used as burial places. And the early church, the Christians in Rome, decorated these with paintings. So those who want to see this can gather around the screen here of my laptop, and you see how simple the art is. Right, this is art obviously done by amateurs, and done in very great simplicity. Hey, this is the catacomb of Calixtus or Callistos. It says Eucharistic. You know, that's the opinion of the art expert or the theologian or the sacred art expert who's looking at it, but sometimes it's not really entirely clear. The Good Shepherd. Now notice the Good Shepherd. He has a sheep around his shoulders, right? But notice, what do you notice about him that's different from our received tradition of Christ, the depiction of Christ? He doesn't have a beard. Right. So remember, this is not meant to be a depiction of Christ as he looked, but is a symbol of Christ as the Good Shepherd, a young man holding the sheep. And it's based on pagan models. There's pagan art showing shepherds, or young shepherds holding sheep on their shoulders. But this is painted by Christians, and it is to depict our Lord as the Good Shepherd. But he's shown as a young beardless youth, because it's a symbol. It's not an icon of Christ, properly speaking. It's a symbol of Christ. It's the Good Shepherd. And of course, here's a famous, very important, the fish and the loaves. The catacombs also from Calixtus. So a great deal of this art were very simple, just scriptural images, the fish and the loaves. There's a wonderful mosaic of the loaves and the fishes in Palestine. We'll look at that sometime. It's one of my favorite place in Palestine, which is in Galilee. It's a place called Tabgha on the Sea of Galilee. And there's a 6th century mosaic of the fish and loaves. You'd recognize it if you saw it. Now here is a bearded Christ.
And there's a halo.
And he has the halo, right?
Or halo.
The halo, well, we say halo. Yeah, the aureole, or the halo.
Yes.
And this is a little later, see? So sometimes the art was purely symbolic, but sometimes it really is iconographic. And what an iconographic representation of Christ or the Mother of God of the Saints is not anti-historical. It is meant to represent the real person, because this is incarnational. The whole theory of iconography, going back to St. John of Damascus, well, St. John of Damascus clarifies, obviously, he's after this time, but he clarifies the fundamental idea, which is the incarnation is the basis for iconography. God became a man. And actually, a great deal of our iconography is remarkably historically accurate. For example, the depictions of St. Peter and Paul go back. There's a famous glass, the bottom of a drinking glass, that shows the faces of Peter and Paul. They look almost exactly like the way they're depicted in iconography until our own time. It's St. Paul with the high forehead, St. Peter with the pugnacious kind of round face. It's really so. A true iconographic art is historical, but it's transformed. It's the historical person, but transformed to show the spiritual meaning of the person, not a carnal or worldly meaning of the person.
When did the icons start to have halos?
That's a good question. I don't know. I don't know when the halo started. This is
But how come?
the halo. I think I'm not sure. I'm not a competent art historian, but I believe the halo was inherited from pagan art. It was to show an important person or a god. It was to show that the person had more than worldly significance. The person had a transcendent significance. But that's a good question. That's one of those things we need to look up and clarify for our clarification sessions.
Is it just a symbolic value then, or
It's-
is
yeah,
it something that people are capable of seeing?
Well, of course. Well, no, it's like the wings that are shown on angels, or the wings shown in St. John the Baptist. The wings. So when angels appear, you don't see they don't have wings. All the true accounts of the appearances of angels, they're always shown as young men in shining white garments. Sometimes people say they look like deacons. Right? Young men, young beardless men shining white garments. The wings are shown as a symbol to indicate the swiftness of their movement and the swiftness of their intelligence. The halo is shown to indicate this is a sacred personage, not an ordinary personage. But in light of the Holy Father's theology of the uncreated light, you could also say the halo is an indication of the uncreated light, right, within and then shining forth from the person. And even in this life, people have been privileged sometimes to see the uncreated light, most obviously in Mount Tabor, where the disciples saw the uncreated light around, but that our Lord's, not just around his head, but his entire form was transformed. And even up until modern times, at various times, disciples of saints were allowed, their eyes were open and they saw the uncreated light shining. Even recent times, there are accounts in the Obtene Elders in the 19th century, or where after they went to communion, their disciples saw them shining with the uncreated light. Or the famous conversation of St. Seraphim from Motovilov, where he saw them shine with the uncreated light. So in light of the Father's theology of the uncreated light, you could relate that to the halo. But I think the original point of the halo was to indicate this is a sacred personage, not someone ordinary. Here's a fresco of a baptism from that same catacomb of Calixtus. So you see, it's very simple. It's very childlike. It's the entrance to the catacombs of San Sebastiano in Rome. Right. Here's some more. Jonah being thrown into the sea. These are wonderful. These are wonderful, lively, childlike depictions. But see, even though it's very simple, it definitely partakes of the childlike. Let's see. Is it not plugged in? It's plugged in, but it says I'm running out of power. No, it's plugged in. All right, very good. It's working. Even though it's childlike, it partakes of the realism, all right, of late antique art. Doesn't have the fully developed iconographic feel to it. This is called. This is a very early example of the Holy Virgin with the child in her womb. You're saying that you know the type of the Mother of God icon. This is the icon of the sign. See, the three young men in the fiery furnace.
Very naive.
Yeah, very very simple. Yeah, very childlike. So this is the very beginnings of our Christian art. St. Paul, look at his face. Look at the face of St. Paul. This is from the 3rd century. And already you see the outlines of the face of St. Paul that's going to characterize his iconographic depiction for all time, which is the long pointed beard and the high forehead of the philosopher, the intellectual. There is almost certainly a very strong oral tradition of the appearance of this man, who had such a vast impact on so many people, and they passed down the tradition of what he looked like. Right. So thus the catacomb art. Now there's another place besides Rome, another very important example of the early Christian art is the church at Dura Europos. Dura Europos is a long-occupied site in Syria that in the early Christian times was a Roman colony. So this is not Syrian art, properly speaking, but actually Roman art, Roman Christian art. And the Dura Europos house is probably from the 3rd century, this early period we're talking about. And it was a house church, because remember the early churches, first they worshipped in people's homes, as in you see in the Acts of the Apostles, they're worshiping actually in homes. So a family would offer part of its house. So a wealthier family in the community would offer part of the house for the church. Then the next step was for the parish to buy a house, which in Latin was called a titulus, because they had the title, they had the deed, the parish had the deed to the house. So the whole house would become the property of the parish, and part of it would be the church, part would be where the bishop or priest lived, part would be where they'd collect alms, part would be a baptistry. And providentially, they removed the frescoes from the house of Dura Europos in Syria, and they're all at Yale University. We could actually make a pilgrimage to Yale and see these frescoes from the house church. Healing of the paralytic. See them carrying his bed? Our Lord heals him and he carries his bed. St. Peter saying, Lord, help me. Peter gets out and walks in the water, and he starts to sink, and Christ lifts him up. The holy myrrh-bearing women at the tomb. This is on one wall of the baptistry. Holy women see it's very simple. The woman at the well. It's providential that these frescoes were removed because ISIS destroyed this entire site last year. They were running around, ISIS, running around just destroying everything that had any cultural value because they're being Wahhabists, right? They're radical iconoclasts, right? They hate all art, they hate all culture. It's Islam taken to its logical extreme, right? So that's the House of Dura Europos. And if you're ever in New Haven, Connecticut, or in the neighborhood, you can go to Yale. I'm not sure what building it's preserved in, but we can easily find out. And you could see this. I would love to see it. It'd be very moving, right, to see this 3rd century Christian art up close. So you see, it's very simple and childlike. It doesn't it hasn't yet acquired all the characteristics of the kind of art that we're talking about. So it's sort of more material art, and yet its very simplicity, though, because of its very simplicity, it doesn't weigh you down. It's already has a warm or a sacred character. Now, there was some sculpture in the early church, and the sculpture was almost always done on sarcophagi. A sarcophagus is a box-like funeral receptacle for a corpse. Okay? It literally means that which eats the flesh, because, of course, the body decomposes. Let's see, early Christian sarcophagi. Not just any kind of sarcophagus, early Christian sarcophagi. I'll never forget the first time I saw early Christian sarcophagi. It was in Marseille. And at the port of Marseille is the Church of St. Victor. And upstairs is a typical sort of post-schism Roman Catholic church, but down in the crypt where the ancient church was, it's full of sarcophagi. And here we go. Sarcophagus of Constantine, of course. Now, this is in the 4th century now. We're looking into the 4th century. But there was some before the 4th century. Here, early Christian sarcophagus in Lateran Museum, Rome. There are scriptural scenes, right? The story of Isaac, Moses on Mount Sinai, healing the blind, the denial of St. Peter, the Lord turning water into wine at Cana of Galilee, and so forth. So you see, it's sculpture, but it's bas-relief, right? It's not really three-dimensional art. Well, this is a depiction of an engraving of a sarcophagus, or an engraving of the art. That's beautiful, isn't it? Stilicho is a early 5th century character, actually. He was a barbarian who was a commander of the Roman army, very important figure, I believe, in the reign of Honorius, the beginning of the 5th century. All right. So there was sculpture, but it was usually bas-relief, and usually on these funerary boxes, on sarcophagi. Now let's go to a little bit later, or rather, well, not later, actually, at the same time period, but a transition to the later art, and that is the Fayum portraiture. Fayum is a place in Egypt, or Fayum portraits, where archaeologists uncovered a vast trove of funerary paintings on mummies. So this is Hellenistic Egypt, right? Remember, Alexander the Great conquers Egypt in the 4th century BC, and educated or aristocratic Egypt becomes Hellenized. They're Greekified Egyptians, are Greeks who live in Egypt. And so the art is Greco-Roman or Hellenistic art, but these are portraits that were placed on people's mummies because they adopted the Egyptian, or they had the Egyptian custom of mummifying, but then they painted these Hellenistic or Greco-Roman style portraits and placed them on the mummies, and they're all the way from the first through the 3rd centuries. Just this time we're talking about the early church. Isn't this beautiful? Look at these. So it's like it's so well preserved, yeah, because things are so well preserved in Egypt because Egypt is so dry, right? That's why Egypt has so many well preserved. Besides the fact that it's so ancient, has so many well preserved artifacts because of the dry climate, and there's just so much of it. Look at this.
Well, it's not that naive anymore.
No, this is sophisticated.
Yeah, proportions are right.
Right. It's the same time period or earlier than the catacomb art. But instead of being executed by very simple people or amateurs, this is executed obviously by experts. And for a wealthy class, right? These is not Christian art. These people were almost certainly mostly pagans, right? But they found also some gold glass miniatures. Look, this could be look how contemporary it looks. It's like someone you'd meet on the street, someone you'd meet today, right? So this is very highly developed sensate art, beautiful, realistic portrayals of people, right? Very good examples of late antique art. Oh, that's more stylistic. That's more like our modern art, isn't it? Look at that. These are beautiful. And so you see, even though this is secular art, and it is sensate, it's focused, it's this worldly art, right? But aspects of it lend itself to being transformed into sacred art, right? It's formal, it's very formal, it's very serene. There's no violent passion. There's nothing pathological or ugly. And it's beautiful, right? It is simultaneously it's realistic, but it's also an ennobling depiction of the person.
The eyes are all big.
The eyes are big, right?
Yeah.
And
all of them.
right, and you can see that lends itself to the transition to Christian iconography, right? Where the eyes are the most important. Ask an iconographer, the eyes are the most important thing. The face is the most important part of the icon, and the eyes are the most important part because the eyes are the window to the soul. These people look very familiar, right? They look like people we can meet at church. Obviously, the Mediterranean, racial, genetic. Egyptian, Greco-Roman. Amazing. That's stunning. That expression. Demetrius, 100 AD. Young boy. So this is really remarkable. I could look at these for hours. They're just so beautiful. But you can see. Now let's juxtapose this and go ahead to one of the most famous icons of all time. The Christ Pantocrator from Mount Sinai. There it is.
No way.
You've seen this icon before, haven't you?
It's beautiful.
Yes, I've seen it in person. I've seen it close up.
You did?
This is one of the most famous icons in the whole world. They just have it hanging in the narthex. You walk into the Catholic on Mount Sinai, it's just hanging there with a lamp in front of it. You can just walk up to it and kiss it. It's from the 6th century. It's very important. These icons on Mount Sinai are very important because they predate iconoclasm. One reason why the examples I'm going to be showing you are from the West, from Rome, is that in the East, everything was destroyed by the iconoclasts. In the 8th and early 9th century, the iconoclasts just went to throughout the Eastern Empire. They destroyed everything. Right? So it's only paradoxically, ironically, in the East, it was only in places under Muslim domination, where the Byzantine emperors had no authority, that in some places preserved this. And we know why. Does anybody remember why Mount Sinai was preserved?
Is it because Muhammad came in and
Yes.
saved him?
When the monks harbored him when he was being persecuted, and because in gratitude he wrote a firman, or whatever a firman was a Turkish word, whatever they called a document, with his handprint, because he was illiterate, so his handprint is at the bottom. I've seen a copy of it. It's in the library at Mount Sinai, where he forbade the Muslims from disturbing the monks. So even a lot of the Muslims were angry a few months ago when ISIS started doing things around, or some terrorists are doing things around the monastery, because it's been this Muslim tradition not to disturb the monastery. And they even have Bedouin Muslim servants for whom they have a mosque located inside the monastery. So one reason why Mount Sinai has the largest collection of ancient Christian art and manuscripts outside the Vatican collection is because it was outside of the reach of the iconoclastic Byzantine emperors during the iconoclasm period. So the icons here are very important. Now, notice this is not what we would call medieval or high Byzantine art. It retains some of the realism of the late antique art.
Yes. Large eyes.
Yeah. Well, the large eyes remain in the Byzantine art, but it's still more realistic, right? It's still more this worldly
Byzantine.
than the Byzantine art,
Yes.
right? This is in the transitional period from the 4th through the 7th centuries. Is a transitional period where they're transitioning from the late antique art to the really high or classically Byzantine period Byzantine art. So it's already has sacred characteristics, but it's still bringing with it the feel of the ancient world. See? It's very moving now, but it already has it's already iconographic because it's not showing a historical Jesus, right? But truly Jesus, our Lord Jesus Christ in the flesh, but with very divine characteristics. Of course, the great halo, and then the eyes are different. Notice one eye is more unthreatening or kind of normal, and the other eye is kind of threatening, and that's to show his human and divine nature. You see, both the approachable and then the unapproachable, the familiar and the transcendent. And of course, he's shown with the hand, showing the two natures of Christ, right, and then the Holy Trinity. And who you Russians, who's going to point that and say, you see, we're right. The old believers, right? He's holding his hand like an old believer, right? These three together and those two together. Just like the old believers say, you see, that's where you're supposed to make the sign of the cross. That's a discussion for another day. So my point in bringing up the 6th century icon at this point is to show how the transition was not immediately to what we would call high Byzantine art. For example, if you look at the two icons on our Templon of Christ and the Mother of God, these are reproductions of very famous icons painted by Theophanius the Cretan in the 16th century. And they come at the end of a long process of extremely ideational art, very high Byzantine art. You see, this is more carrying with it the imprint of the ancient world before the complete development of Byzantine art. Still very powerful. The medium is encaustic, which is actually it's made with wax. Yeah, I don't know exactly how it works. An artist could explain that. Also on Mount Sinai, we see Sinai icon of St. Peter from the same period, in the same style. Here he is. See? His face is very familiar to us, isn't it? That's very close to how St. Peter's still depicted in all the icons. Very pugnacious face. It's a peasant face. He's a tough man.
Again, very realistic.
Again, it's realistic. Yes, this is the transition between late antique art and early Byzantine art. It's also, even though it's not as ethereal or as transcendent as later Byzantine art, it's still already obviously very sacred art. Here's Christ and the Mother of God and another saint above. Some think it's Moses, some think it's St. John the Evangelist. And there's one more, which is the Holy Virgin, the Sinai icon of the Virgin enthroned. There she is. These three are some of those famous icons ever executed. There we are. See, it's late antique art. It's sacred, and yet it still bears the marks of the realistic or sensate late antique art. These are the Virgin enthroned with the child in her lap, angels, and Saints Theodore, the Holy Martyrs Theodore and George. These three icons are very precious because they're just about all we have remaining of the panel iconography before iconoclasm in the East. Right. Now let's talk about architecture for a little while. Let's talk about the Christian basilica. So the basilica was originally a secular building for public purposes, courts and so forth, town councils, markets, things like that. But the church took it and made it into the classic form of a church building. Now there's some confusion. Roman Catholics, the Roman Catholic Church took the word basilica and used it as an honorary title that they attached to very important churches or cathedrals. But we're speaking of basilica as a form, a rectangular form. Now here's an example of the remains of a secular basilica. Okay, Maxentius and Constantine. Maxentius was actually the person Constantine defeated. I suppose Maxentius started it and St. Constantine finished it. This is a basilica, but it's a basilica built for secular reasons, as a court or a civic building. Okay. Then they took the basilicas and they made them, and they used that form for the church. And there was an old St. Peter's at Rome,
4th century,
built by St. Constantine. There are various unpleasant realities about the present St. Peter's at Rome. One of those unpleasant realities is that they tore down a 4th century basilica to build that thing. That's how the church looked. That's how the old St. Peter's looked in the 4th century. So you see, this is a classic basilica form. It has the great central space of the nave. It has the raised altar at the other end with the iconostas in front of it. See, with the steps leading up. Looks very familiar, doesn't it? In the 4th century. And the side aisles. Now, this is a basilica that had 2 side aisles. The simplest form has 1 side aisle, or 1 set of columns on the inside. This martyrium, this church of St. Peter's relics, had 2 side aisles. And the upper story is called the clerestory. Right? It has 2 clerestories. So it wasn't the simplest form of basilica. It was a more developed form of basilica. But it was built by St. Constantine. And they tore this down to build that Renaissance Baroque monstrosity of a church they have there in Rome.
This is incredible. Such a building in the 4th century.
And the 4th century. They knew what they were doing. Yeah, remember, this is a very old, highly advanced civilization. These are not savages. Right. Statue. Now this is a medieval statue of St. Peter. I don't know what that's doing there. Oh, Old St. Peter's. That's why we went to Old St. Peter's. All right. Let's look at Santa Sabina, the oldest intact Roman basilica. Saint Sabina, the Holy Virgin Martyr Sabina. This building is important because it is a 5th century basilica that still has its original form. Most of the Roman churches were modified in the Middle Ages and the Renaissance, but this one retained its classical form. Very simple. You see, on the outside it's very simple. There's the great rectangular nave.
It's incredible.
No transepts. It hasn't developed the cross form yet with the transepts, but it has the shallow apse. The apse is the semicircle at the front, at the back, or at the head of the church, right where the bishop would sit with the clergy. It's the outside of the church, and there's the inside. Now, this art is later. That apse fresco is probably from the Middle Ages or the Renaissance, or Baroque, so it's later. And the lowered ceiling is probably from the Renaissance. But the rest, the church has really retained its pure classical form.
So how was the ceiling before that?
Oh,
It's just
rafters. you'd see through the rafters to the peaked wooden ceiling.
Very big windows.
Mm-hmm. To let in light. But you're looking at a church built in the 5th century, and they're still using it. Sadly, it's no longer an Orthodox church. Now let's look at the apse. The apse is a semicircle at the head of the church. So here's the rail, or the which they probably tore down the iconostas at some point, right? At some point, there was a whole screen, and sometime probably in the Counter-Reformation period, in the 16th or 17th century, they lowered it and made just a rail. But almost certainly at one point there was a raised screen, iconostasis. And the apse, they would put a bench all the way around the inside, and the bishop's throne would be in the back, in the center, and then the priest would sit on the bench, the bishop, which we still do in Orthodox churches.
Looks more like Catholic.
Well, the art is Roman Catholic. Yes.
5th century.
Yeah. The art is Roman Catholic. Is later. It's non-Orthodox. But we're just looking at the architecture now. Now, besides Rome, another place you really have to look is Ravenna. Ravenna is a very important place. It's in northeastern Italy, and it was the last capital of the Western Empire before it was before the abdication of the last emperor in 476. Then it was reconquered for the Roman Empire by Justinian, who and during the Byzantine period in the 6th century, they built beautiful, important early Byzantine churches. Probably many of you have seen this famous mosaic of
It's not Saint Sophia.
No.
It looks like the Saint Constantine from the Saint Sophia Church from Turkey.
Yes, well, Hagia Sophia is built in the same period.
Okay.
Hagia Sophia is built at the same time, but Ravenna is important because Ravenna has a large number of buildings, some from the 5th century and some from the 6th century. The ones the most famous one from the 5th century is the Mausoleum of Galla Placidia. No, that's not Galla Placidia. Let's look at the Mausoleum of Galla Placidia. Galla Placidia Mausoleum. This is a 5th century building. This one I would love to go to Ravenna. I would really love to see this little mausoleum. I've looked at pictures of it for years. It's an interior view. It's a little bitty building, but you walk in, and it has completely intact mosaics from the 5th century. And you can see. Let's see if we can look at this. Look at the ceiling with the luminous cross surrounded by the stars.
I want to see it now.
I'd like to see it. Now, here's Christ shown as a beardless youth, the Good Shepherd. So this is a late antique depiction of Christ. Symbolically, and everyone knew that our Lord had a beard, right? But symbolically, he's shown as the Good Shepherd as the youth. Also, the beardless youth is also a symbol of is late ancient art as a symbol of the philosopher or the wise man. Here's Christ as a good shepherd holding the cross with his sheep. That's us. Here's St. Lawrence. Remember that St. Lawrence is the Archdeacon of Rome who was roasted alive on a grid. And he's the one who told him to turn him over. He said, "I'm done now. You can turn me over." He was so brave. And now he can turn me over. That's showing his grid. And it's showing a cabinet with the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, because one of the reasons St. Lawrence was arrested and tortured was that he wouldn't hand over copies of the Gospels to the pagan authorities. One of the reasons many Christians were martyred is that the pagan authorities would demand that they'd hand over holy things, hand over the chalice, hand over the book of the Gospels, and they wouldn't do it. And those who handed them over, who chickened out and handed them over, even if they didn't actually worship Zeus or worship Caesar, they were still regarded as apostates. They were called traditors, those who handed over. Traditor. They were traitors, right? A traitor means literally a hand over, a person who hands over. So St. Lawrence died because he would not be a traditor. See, so this is in Gallipoli. Now, this is mosaic, but it's really from the late antique period. But then you go to the 5th century, and you have the first really great example of the round or octagonal or cross-shaped church, which is San Vitale in St. Vitalius in Ravenna, built in the Byzantine period, after the Byzantines had reconquered the Romans. The Romei had reconquered Italy from the Ostrogoths. So here's San Vitale. What does it remind you of? Hagia Sophia. Right? It's like a study. It's like a miniature study for Hagia Sophia. It's an octagonal church. There's a famous...
This was built prior to Hagia Sophia?
No, a little bit of just a few years before Hagia Sophia. But that's the Empress Theodora, the consort of Justinian. This is just, we know what Justinian looked like. That's what he looked like. This is a contemporary depiction of Justinian. The great Justinian. And let's see if we can see the entire mosaic. San Vitale is important, therefore, because it is a 5th century early Byzantine church. It's the first great, it's the first great example of the round or octagonal church style as opposed to the basilica style. And its model is from the mausolea, right? So the basilica is modeled on civic buildings. The round or octagonal or cross-shaped church, or Greek cross, that is equal bar cross church, as opposed to the Latin cross or the basilica of the transepts. But the round church is modeled on the mausolea. Let's see if we can get the entire... Here it is. Mosaic of Justinian and his retinue. That's up above the altar. There's Justinian. Maximianus, who was the bishop of Ravenna, probably during whose episcopate the church was built. Priests, deacon, courtiers, soldiers. Very serious-looking people. Very real, right? It's lively. It's very real. Just
not big.
Not big beards. Just the bishop and the clergy have little beards. Yep. And the emperor has a little beard. The soldiers are. And this period, I guess they didn't wear beards. Soldiers didn't have beards. Yeah. Yeah. And you see the old tonsure. That's the way the monks used to be, or the clerics used to be tonsured, with the corona on top. Which is actually, the traditionalists Roman Catholic order still tonsure the monks like that. There are things the Latins do that are actually ancient usages. One of them is the tonsure. There's, on the opposite wall, above the altar, is the empress and her retinue. Her eunuchs and her ladies-in-waiting. See, they're both bringing offerings. Justinian was bringing the basket with the prosphora, the anaphora, and she's bringing the wine to give to the deacons to offer the liturgy. See? So they're the rulers of the world, of Ecumeny, and they're, like any other believer, they're bringing their bread and wine to the church. They're making their offerings to the church. See? These are very famous mosaics, and you'll see this in any study of Christian sacred art. You'll see these study these mosaics. All right, let's see. Here's an interior shot of the church. There's San Vitale. It's looking out one of the entrances. See, it's large. It's not nearly as large as Hagia Sophia, but it's large. Yes. See how the windows are just plain glass? It never was stained glass. Stained glass is a medieval Western invention. But many, many ancient churches in Italy just still have the plain glass. That is still characteristic of Orthodox churches. Here's Christ. I'm going to get a close-up of this. Oh. Let's see if I can zoom in. This is an apse mosaic of Christ enthroned, but look, no beard. So we're still in that transitional period. It's very hieratic, right? He's shown coming in glory, sitting, the Lord of the cosmos. But it's still shown with no beard.
The
Look.
clothes would be different later on because Jesus is shown just in blue and red or white. Here it's like
Kind of a dark red.
dark red.
Yeah, because I don't know how well the photograph represents it. Look in the ceiling, the Lamb of God. This is from the Apocalypse. The vision of the Lamb of St. John the Apocalypse.
But the details in the mosaic are amazing.
Yes, this craftsmanship is just stunning.
And lasted so long.
It's like,
Yes.
that's the glory, that's the usefulness of mosaic. Mosaic is permanent. Yes, mosaic is very long lasting. Yes. Now let's go to a church built at the same time, the 6th century, Mount Sinai, St. Catherine's Mount Sinai, St. Catherine Monastery, Mount Sinai. At the same time, Justinian was building these churches in Ravenna and in Constantinople, Hagia Sophia, which we're all familiar with. He was building a series of fortresses on the eastern borders, and one of those fortresses was a monastery, where he enclosed the ancient monastery at Mount Sinai with a wall, and he built a great Catholicon, a great church. There's the church. It doesn't look big in this picture, but this complex is very large. That actually is a very large church.
You can see the people next door.
Yes, you can see the people next to it. The walls are from Justinian's time, from the 6th century, but the parts that are rebuilt were rebuilt by Napoleon by his troops when they were occupying Egypt around the late 1790s. The bell tower this is the church. It's a basilica form. There's the church. Let's see, go inside the church. There's the church. That's the ossuary chapel with the bones of the monks. Oh, that's the Mohammed's prompt. Yeah, this is a copy, because when the Muslims heard that they had something written by Muhammad, they wanted it, but they made out an exact copy. This is a copy of the one that Muhammad gave them, but it's extremely ancient. It's in the library at Mount Sinai, and the librarian at Mount Sinai actually is an American, Father Justin. He's from Texas. He's the first non-Greek to be the librarian of Mount Sinai, which is really one of the most important positions in the world.
This is already Byzantine.
This is Byzantine. This is later. Yeah, this is 12th, 13th century. I'm trying to get a picture of that's the icon of the Virgin we've seen already. I'm trying to get a picture of the Catholicon, because we're looking at churches now. Interiors of the church. Monastery. Interior view Catholicon, Mount Sinai.
He didn't call me.
Interior. Let's see. Nope. Well, I'll have to go elsewhere. Let's see. Website. St. Catherine's has a website. St. Catherine's Monastery. .com. Isn't that something? This ancient monastery has a .com. Here we are, Mount Sinai. Description, the description, treasures. I want to see the inside of the church. Well, at least let's look at the great apse mosaic. Here's one, mosaics. Well, where's the image? Just as a description.
No.
Where is their photo album? I'm sorry I wasn't better prepared for this. I thought we could find this easily. I know I've looked at these photographs for hours on the internet. I don't know why I can't find them now. All right. St. Catherine. Here we go. Well, that's
Give us links.
yeah, there are links there. All right. Gallery of photos of St. Catherine. I want to see the inside of the Catholicon. The Catholicon is the main church of a monastery. Oh, what's that? Nope. Whirling dervishes? No, we don't want any whirling dervishes. Right, we'll have to... I promise for next time I'm going to find photographs of Mount Sinai. I had a beautiful coffee table book of Mount Sinai. I can't find it. So the Catholicon of Mount Sinai is a great basilica form, and it has one of the most famous artworks of the ancient Christian world, which is the great apse mosaic from the 6th century. Let's put apse mosaic. Mount Sinai, apse mosaic of the Transfiguration. When you walk into the church, you can't see it because there's a 17th century or 16th century wooden iconostas in front of everything. But you have to walk around to the side and you can see the ancient apse mosaic. There it is. Well, I can show you a better picture. It's on my Facebook page. There it is. That's the apse mosaic. It's vast, actually. It's very large. And it's from the 6th century. Of course, here our Lord is bearded.
Most of the saints.
And the saints are, except for St. John, who's shown as a young man, beardless. John, Peter, and James, Moses and Elias. The great aureole, or mandorla. The word for the halo that goes all the way around the body is the mandorla. It's a mandorla. It indicates the uncreated light shining from him. So if you get to go to Mount Sinai and you go to St. Catherine's and you want to see the mosaic, you have to go. You can't just when you walk in, you don't see it because now this great wooden iconostasis blocks your view of the apse mosaic. You have to go around to the side and you look up. And you see it. I'll never forget the moment I saw it. I wanted to stand there forever and just stay there, look at it. So this is from the 6th century. Again, as with the mosaics in Ravenna, it's showing clearly the transition from the late antique to Byzantine. It's more hieraticized. Right? It's more stylized than the pure late antique art. It's already transitioning to what we came to be called Byzantine art. So I'm sorry, I apologize that we didn't have a photograph of the interior of the Catholicon at Mount Sinai, but I'll try to find that. I'll make a note to find that for next time. So Ravenna and Mount Sinai, back to Ravenna. You've got to see one of the most beautiful basilicas. Saint Apollinare in Classe. So Ravenna was very important because it's a late western capital of the Roman Empire, and then later it was the capital of the Byzantine Exarchate after Justinian reconquered Italy for the empire away from the Ostrogoths. And it has a a large number of late antique and Byzantine buildings. And here is a beautiful example. This is a really pure example of a basilica. If you want to show people what an ancient Christian basilica looked like, here's St. Apollinarius in Classe. Classe is a suburb of Ravenna. It was the ancient naval base, the Roman naval base. This is the apse mosaic. And you see, they haven't yet developed the whole schema where you always have the platitera tonoranon, the Virgin more spacious in the heavens, in the apse. There is a lot more variety. They haven't yet fully developed all the rules, all the canons. So this is a luminous cross, but this is a symbolic representation of the Transfiguration. We just saw an actual representation of the Transfiguration at Mount Sinai. This is a symbolic representation. Now, how do we know it's a Transfiguration? Because this is Moses and Elias, and the three sheep represent Peter, James, and John. But instead of showing Christ, it shows the cross, because it's conflating the theophany at the Transfiguration with the second coming. Why the second coming? Why the cross? Because in Matthew 24:30, Christ says, "And then the sign of the Son of Man shall appear in the heavens." He's talking about his second coming. What is the sign of the Son of Man? The cross. So this is the sign of the Son of Man appearing in the heavens, but it's also the Transfiguration, because here's Moses and Elias, and the three representing Peter, James, and John. So that's the apse mosaic. Let's see if we can get a view of the nave. That's St. Apollinarius. See, that's what the ceilings looked like. You just see the rafters. See, this is a very simple basilica. It's just a 3-aisle basilica, just with 2 side aisles. The large open space and the raised. Of course, at one time it did have iconostasis, and the Westerners started taking down the screens and just reducing them to rails during the Renaissance and Counter-Reformation periods, for some reason. I guess we'll talk about that later on. But this is a classic view, interior view of a classic basilica, and they're still using it. The Catholics are still using it. This is a building, a completely intact, extant building, still being used as a church from the 6th century. All right, so that is Santa Apollinare, that's Ravenna. Now, just quickly to show now the full development, if we want to jump ahead to the fully developed Byzantine art, we have 2 great examples in Greece, one at Osios Lukas and one at Daphne. Osios Lukas is on the western side of Greece, in Voitia, not far from the ancient Delphi, the famous Delphi. It's in a village called Styri. If you ever go to Greece, make sure you go see Osios Lukas. Now, this is a 10th century building, and it has mosaics from the High Byzantine period. This is fully developed Byzantine art. The Virgin with Child. Angels.
Big eyes.
The big eyes. You see, it's much more stylized, right? So we've left the late antique period. We've gone to the truly Byzantine period here. This is High Byzantine art. Now, this is a fresco. Osios Lukas is interesting because it has both mosaics and frescoes. Because fresco is a technique where the painting is painted on wet plaster on the wall. And the advantage of fresco is that, like mosaic, it's quite permanent. Mosaic. Agios Marcos, Saint Mark, the evangelist. Archangel Michael, Saint Paul. Agios Dionysios, one of the prophets. Agios Zacharias, Saint Zachary. This is the crypt. I don't know the provenance of these pieces here. Some wonderful mosaics. Official site of Osius Lukos. Let's see if that site's more helpful than the St. Catherine. That's their saint. His relics are there. You can venerate his relics. Uma série de fotografias. The Virgin with the Child, with the ox and the ass. The very earliest depictions of the Nativity show the ox and the ass. Very early. This is very early on. This is already an ancient tradition when this mosaic was made, of the ox and the ass. And the child wrapped in swaddling clothes, which are a prefiguration, of course, of his burial shroud. The ox and the ass, the Holy Fathers interpret the prophecy. I think that's from Habakkuk, where it says, "He will be shown forth between the two living creatures." It's a prophecy of the birth of the Savior, shown forth between two living creatures. Of course, this is imperial art, right? It's sponsored by the emperors, and so this is. Oh, but these are not imperial personages. These are the saints: Saint Marina, Saint Catherine, Saint Barbara. Holy martyrs, holy women martyrs. But it's very imperial regalia, isn't it? This is the high Byzantine period. So do see Osius Lukos if you can, if you go to Greece. And the other is the other big surviving ensemble of Byzantine iconography in Greece is at Daphne. That's close to Athens. That's from the 11th century. Last time I was there, it was closed. It had this scaffolding around it because they're doing renovations. It has a very important collection of mosaics. That's the ground plan. The famous Pantocrator. You've probably seen that before. That's from Daphne. You see. No longer the gentle shepherd, but the judge of the living and the dead, the Lord of the universe. Oh, how do we get to the Pantheon? Tomb of Philip of Macedon. No, we don't want to see that. That's not tonight. Okay, so this is Daphne. There are some links. Oh. Well, we could look at these things all night. So you can see that. My point tonight was to show the transition between late antique art and Byzantine art, properly speaking. In Byzantine art, really, they developed to a very high degree these characteristics we talked about, of hieratic, of hierarchy, of the art being ascetical, otherworldly, and so forth. This is real Orthodox art. And the amazing thing is that one indication that the Orthodox Church is the real church, is of divine origin, that the church is alive. As St. Augustine said, ever ancient, ever new. Orthodoxy isn't old. Orthodoxy isn't new. Orthodoxy is immortal. So the church always renews herself. So when we want to renew our iconography, we just go back to the old forms, but then creatively bring them back to life. So the creativity of the church is always fecund, it's always life-giving, it never dies because it's of divine origin. We don't have to reinvent the wheel. So it's getting late, so I just want to show you a few of these examples. And later on, when we get to the Middle Ages and we're talking about the schism, we will see how the schism and the breaking away from Orthodoxy then rapidly affects the development of the Western Christian art. And it over the course of a couple of centuries, it becomes something distinctively different, quite different. And we'll talk about that.